of a new universe. And so when the Celestials were creating stars and planets and solar systems and galaxies and different things like that, they were filling up the void that housed Null with all kinds of life. And so basically Null woke up and war between them broke out. The issue with this is that Null didn't really seemingly know how to defeat a Celestial right off the bat. And he did to a degree in the sense that he fashioned a sword and then basically killed them or chopped off the head of one of them. But following that and following his defeat where he was cast back into the void again kind of hitting at the idea that he originates from outside of this universe, somewhere out in the multiverse, that what Null did is he fashioned what was called the all-black Necro Sword. Now, this is where we start tying into Jason Aaron's Thor, because for those of you guys who read God Butcher, we didn't know where the all-black Necro Sword came from. What Donny Cates is doing here is kind of providing the back end of that and saying that when Null had essentially faced off and decapitated one of the Celestials and was banished by the rest of them, he created the all-black Necro Sword and then went on a campaign literally fighting every god that he came across and just inflicting death and destruction everywhere he could. And when that happened, he ultimately came across one being, the two of them fought each other, and when they effectively killed each other, they landed on a planet that belonged to Gore. And Gore, discovering their bodies, picked up the all-black Necro Sword, not really knowing what it was capable of. So again, it's cool because what this does is kind of tie in. It really sort of ties together a lot of these little plot points that have kind of been floating out there in Marvel Comics with regards to other people's work. And so following this, what ended up happening with Null is that he basically sort of reawoke on this planet that he was on, but realized he could bond his life essence to other beings, essentially becoming the first symbiote. And when that happened, he basically began to sort of corral all these different concepts that existed out there, sort of creating symbiotes or creating a kind of hive mind, and then literally saw all of them from across the universe. So through a kind of seat of power, he could watch the universe and watch how his symbiotes were interacting with other races and other beings that went out there, and then essentially just kind of like control them in and of himself. And so what ended up happening is that when he arrived on Earth, that his connection to all these symbiotes that existed out there was disrupted when he fought Thor, and Thor, literally using the power of lightning as one of the weaknesses of the symbiotes, kind of cut off the connection between Null and these various symbiotes that existed across the universe. And so again, because all this happened presumably billions of years ago, countless years ago, what this does is it back ends to Brian Michael Bendis' Planet of the Symbiotes. And it says that following the defeat of Null, in the Planet Symbiote storyline that was created by Bendis, all these symbiotes took up residence on a singular planet. Now, the way that Null kind of plays this off is we view it as a planet, but really it's just a gathering of the largest horde of symbiotes. In reality, there are other symbiotes that exist in other places across the entirety of the universe, but the brunt of them exists on that singular planet. And so we kind of have to assume the way that Bendis writes it and the way that Donny Cates writes this, we can kind of combine the two of them together and say, well, from Null's perspective, the symbiotes really just kind of gathered in a singular place. But the way that Bendis writes it, the symbiotes kind of came together and formed a sort of a role that they played where they basically became kind of knights of the universe, which is to say that what they would do is they would bond themselves to a singular host. And when that happened, that host would become a kind of savior of the universe, or at least a section of the universe akin to like the Green Lanterns from DC. But a symbiote could be corrupted by a singular being. The way that Donny Cates writes this is he kind of says that's not really the case. Instead, what happens is the inherent nature of a symbiote is to be dark. It is to be evil because that's what it originates from. And so where Bendis would say these symbiotes can bond themselves, and much like the Venom version on Earth basically became corrupted by Eddie Brock, what actually happened is the Venom symbiote touched the light, so to speak, touched the good guy, and became a good guy when it bonded itself to Peter Parker. So basically, it betrayed its nature when it joined Peter Parker and became a good guy, and then when it left Peter and joined Eddie, it reverted back to its normal nature and became a bad guy. That's way back in the early days. Along the way, the Venom symbiote has started to become a good guy again. And so it's kind of cool because what it does is it takes the entire concept of Venom as we know it and flips it on its head. Instead of believing the Venom symbiote is inherently a good guy who became a bad guy because of Venom and then became a good guy again, which was its normal part, then instead the Venom symbiote was always a bad guy, and then it became a good guy with Peter. It went back to its normal nature with Eddie, and then it's been working its way to try to become a good guy ever since. It's been betraying its nature this entire time. And so that's kind of the cool thing here. It works exceedingly well. And so what this does is it hits home at the idea that with Null basically returning, what he's done is restore his connection to the various symbiotes that exist out there, and then intends to kind of go on a conquest and sort of go ballistic and so on and so forth. But what it's been doing is really kind of saying, okay, this Null as we see him now is actually just a symbiote. The actual Null exists out there on a planet somewhere and is just kind of waiting to be reborn and to return itself. But in order for Null to actually return, for the actual Null to come back, what it needs is like a fifth missing piece, basically saying that like the other four symbiotes that it absorbed when it first popped up as a giant bat-looking thing, that's 4 out of 5 pieces of a puzzle. It needs the 5th piece, and then Null himself will actually return. And when that happens, the indication is the universe could presumably be doomed because of the massive amount of power that Null possesses. And so it's kind of cool here, because basically with this whole thing unfolding, kind of going down the way that it is, this leads to Venom symbiote telling Eddie Brock, because of the fact that we've encountered this Null symbiote, what it means is that now we have a host of power. So it's kind of a way for Donny Cates to introduce new abilities to Venom by just sort of saying, hey, this part of the symbiote has been unlocked, more or less. But when Venom, when Eddie Brock sits down and starts to think about everything that's been going on, what he does is realize not everything is what it seems, especially if like the 5th piece of this Grendel, basically this kind of missing pieces have to all be brought back together. The 5th one is here for a reason, because like Null is looking for it. And so what he ends up doing is traveling back to Rex Strickland and basically saying, give me the whole story. And that's when we find out this is not actually Rex Strickland. Instead, this is the symbiote of Rex Strickland. That somewhere along the line, Rex Strickland himself had basically died. That when the symbiote bonded to Rex, that it basically became a good guy, and much the same way that the symbiote did when it bonded to Flash Thompson originally, and then is now kind of back to Eddie Brock, that it's basically a good guy here, that because Rex had died, the symbiote kind of continued on in his image. And so this symbiote was originally part of the horde of Null, and in order for Null to come back, this symbiote is kind of like the last missing piece that needs to be bonded with the Null symbiote in order for that Null symbiote to travel back to the home planet of the symbiotes, and then for Null to finally rise. And so that's when they sort of bond together. When Eddie says the only way for you to truly be safe is to bond yourself to me, and when that happens, everything will be fine, like everything will be okay. And so with the two of them basically bonding together and working together as a singular unit, they look pretty awesome. They look pretty badass. But it's basically Eddie with all the new powers he got from touching Null, along with all the existing powers he got from the Rex Strickland symbiote. So again, it's pretty awesome here. It's basically kind of combining all these different abilities together. The problem with this is that with them facing off against this Null version of the symbiote, it's wildly powerful. Like it's extremely capable and not easily destroyed. And so Eddie showing up here is kind of like, okay, look, we can't really defeat it in and of ourselves. Like at the most, we're a stopgap measure, because what Null does is kind of try to tap into the symbiote of Rex and the Venom version, and it actually cannot control them. And so because it cannot control them, the response is, well, then I'll just kill the host and I'll take them forcefully. And so again, trying to kill Eddie, it's Eddie basically like blasting him with like sonic bombs, sonic grenades, and so on and so forth. And then it kind of begins to wrap up relatively fast, insofar that what ends up happening is the Venom symbiote basically says the only way for you to really win is to use the one absolute weakness, which is fire. And so in this instance, Eddie grabs Null and just kind of like forces him into like this furnace, basically, and where Null kind of tries to latch on and tries to get out and so on and so forth. It's literally burning the Venom symbiote and then burning Null along with the Rex Strickland symbiote, kind of burning them all at the same time. And so where Eddie himself is actually on fire and not really looking to like sacrifice or lose his own symbiote in the process, the symbiote in turn bonds to Eddie, because where the symbiote like jumps off like, oh my god, it's fire, I gotta go. Eddie says, no, you have to come back, you have to keep me alive here in order to make sure that like Null dies, basically asking the Venom symbiote to sacrifice itself. And that's exactly what happens. The Venom symbiote rebonds itself to Eddie, keeps him alive long enough to keep the door closed, and then in turn, while he's laying there, the Venom symbiote basically seems to have been killed. It seems to have been eliminated by the fact that Eddie can't really hear it anymore. So again, it's a cool story. I'm surprised it took me so long to cover this thing. And Donny Cates, dude, okay, so his Venom symbiote, Venom run is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. Okay, so picking up with Venom Volume 2, which is Oversight, this is actually pretty cool. All right, here's the funny thing about this. All right, and this, again, like we've talked about this before, and we're going to kind of rehash this a little bit again, just for people who are new. So the idea behind this is that this is, in a lot of ways, kind of a soft reboot, but it comes off the heels of really like one of the biggest changes in like the whole Spider-Man / Venom mythos, which was part of Marvel Legacy and like the death of Flash Thompson. The idea behind this is that, again, because the second volume kind of comes off the heels of the first, which is to say like the death of the Venom God, but at the same time, the events of like Eddie Brock. Now, of course, with it only being Volume 1, we kind of assumed that like Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote wouldn't actually be killed. Instead, it was just kind of left on this sort of ambiguous tone of like, what will happen next? And so what this does is it picks up with like some guy who's basically speaking directly to Eddie and essentially kind of running over like the things that happened. And from the perspective of Eddie, the way this played out is that Eddie Brock himself, along with the Venom symbiote, had destroyed like Null the Venom God, and then like that was the end of that. that. And then basically like the Venom symbiote seems to have either been killed or like out of commission. And then somewhere along the line, Eddie Brock just like woke up in this place where this guy's essentially talking to him, wanting to know where the sample went. And the reason why was because after Venom and Eddie Brock had defeated Null, somebody came along and then gathered a sample of the Venom symbiote. But Eddie himself has no idea where the Venom symbiote is. And when this guy starts referencing things like Project Pegasus and starts talking about, hey, like I work for an organization and things along those lines, Eddie's assumption is that it's S.H.I.E.L.D. And the reason why is because one, the suit this guy's wearing bears the color scheme of S.H.I.E.L.D. and two, because this is how S.H.I.E.L.D. would do things. But then we end up finding out that this guy is actually the Maker. Now, the Maker has been a free-floating character in Marvel Comics for like 4 years. Ever since Secret Wars happened in 2015, Marvel's never really done anything with him. And it's one of those funny situations because the Maker came around so close to the end of the Ultimate Universe and like the launch of Secret Wars that it was one of those things where like when Secret Wars happened and like the multiverse collapsed and then it was all recreated by the main Marvel Universe, Reed Richards, the Maker was just kind of floating around there and anybody could have done anything with him. Ultimately, they didn't. He was just kind of there for like a villain, I think, in like the New Avengers with Robert DaCosta. And then like that was it. It was a couple other appearances here and there. And this is really like the next instance where he's being used. But the idea is that Maker's essentially working for an organization which initially took the sample of the Venom symbiote after, everything happened with Null, and then somebody stole it from Reed. And so that's kind of the question is, who was it that took it? Who was it that stole it? And their assumption is that it's Eddie Brock. And the way that Maker kind of talks here is that Eddie Brock's not fully aware of what's going on. And that's kind of the irony here, because we always sort of assume that even if Eddie Brock doesn't recall everything, what he forgets, the Venom symbiote remembers. And that's where the question kind of comes into of like, where's the Venom symbiote in all of this? And that's what it sort of comes to an explanation, because what the Maker does is basically say, what actually happened here is not what you believe. What you believe is that you defeated Null and the Venom symbiote wasn't answering you when you were talking to it. You kind of collapsed, you thought you died, and then like you woke up here sometime later. What he basically says is, it's been 5 weeks since the defeat of Null. And it's kind of crazy because what he says is like, when that all happened and my guy showed up in order to take a sample, all hell broke loose. Like the Venom symbiote just kind of reacted instinctively, bonded itself to you, killed like 4 of my men, and then took off. And for the next 3 weeks, we had no idea where you were. It took us forever to track you down, but when we did, we tracked you down to your father's house. And it's kind of a cool thing because of the question Eddie Brock has and the question we as the reader have is why the house of his father? And of course, that'll be explained later on. But at the moment, it's just kind of like, why this of all places? Because we know the relationship between Eddie and his father wasn't like the greatest thing ever. Now, of course, ultimately he was caught and he was brought here, but 5 weeks have passed. It's been 3 weeks while he was on the run, and for the last 2 weeks he's been here. And so what seems to have gone on is that there's been this kind of cyclical pattern that like Eddie Brock is brought in, Eddie Brock is interrogated, and then for some reason that's never fully explained, the Venom symbiote plays this kind of role as protector for Eddie and then wipes his mind of the memories of what he's been experiencing for the last 2 weeks. And so effectively, every day is the first day. Every day is the new day for Eddie. And it's kind of a cool thing here because what Reed kind of speculates here, and it's one of the things he doesn't really even know, what Maker kind of speculates here is that like because the Venom symbiote is for all intents and purposes brain dead, what it means is that it's just kind of like wiping sections of his mind away. It's playing the role of a protector. It's never actually left Eddie. It's been with him the whole time. But it's kind of a crazy thing. And the reason why I say it's a bit of a soft reboot is because what Donny Cates seems to be doing here is essentially kind of wiping away a lot of the Venom stuff that came before him, which is to say the personality of Venom, the idea that like it relates to the host, so like it was a bad guy originally when it first bonded to Eddie, then it became a good guy when it bonded to Flash Thompson, and now it, then it went to kind of maintain the good guy role as part of Eddie. Now it's just kind of being just an organism that's there. And what it does is it kind of sets the stage for Donny Cates to go in a couple different ways. Either he can bring it back and kind of return the personality of the Venom symbiote, kind of turn this into like an arc really more for the symbiote than for Eddie, kind of like its death and rebirth, or he could build it up into something else completely. But the explanation that's given here is that the Venom symbiote was able to maintain its autonomy, able to kind of maintain its personality, things like that, because it was tied into the hive mind of like all the Venoms, and the connection to that hive mind was basically like the mind or the existence of like the symbiote god. But when Null was destroyed, the connection went with it. And so basically this symbiote, as it's bonded to Eddie, is just kind of a free-floating item out there. It's no different than like a knife or a hammer. And so it's kind of a crazy thing because what Maker ends up doing is basically saying, hey, look, like along the way, we've learned little bits of information here. We've learned little tidbits here. And all this really kind of comes out of the death of Flash Thompson, which is interesting because Eddie didn't know that Flash Thompson died. Now, the reason for that is because a lot of that was kind of wrapping up the Flash Thompson arc, which had been going on for quite some time. Like it really started with Agent Venom, maybe a little bit before then, and it had been running for more than a little bit. But what this did is it went into the events of Marvel Legacy and Amazing Spider-Man number 800, which essentially had like Flash Thompson as Agent Venom being killed off. And the reason why was because during the whole Red Goblin incident, where you basically had like the Carnage symbiote bonded to Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, it kind of turned into almost like an Ultimate Universe Spider-Man scenario where where like you had Green Goblin or I guess really the Red Goblin, basically like facing off against some of Spider-Man foes and even some of Spider-Man's friends and so on and so forth. But basically like Flash Thompson made the choice to sacrifice his life in order to save the friends of Spider-Man and even Spider-Man himself using his healing abilities. And what that did is it kind of etched in stone the idea that Flash Thompson was kind of like this incorruptible being, right? Like, you know, when he got the Venom symbiote, he wasn't corrupted by it, he wasn't screwed up by it, he became a good guy with it. It's kind of the idea that like Flash Thompson is the basis behind what a hero could truly be. The cool thing about this is that what Maker does is he effectively tells Eddie Brock that what they've learned after taking a sample of Flash Thompson is they learned that like when a symbiote bonds itself to a host, that it never actually leaves entirely. That when a symbiote leaves a host, for example, when the Venom symbiote left left Flash, what it did is it left a kind of sample of itself on Flash Thompson's